We're good? All right, turn to Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, verse 4. A lot of times when we're going through a lot of the information that we're looking at in Baptist history, because so much of it is historical information, sometimes I feel a little guilty almost that we don't look into the scriptures as much as I like. So I wanted to start out with a verse. At least we'll get that, okay? So we're in Romans 15 in verse 4, and it says, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope." This, of course, is Paul is writing concerning the Old Testament and all that is given to us in the Old Testament. And his point is that those things in the Old Testament were written so that we could learn from it. And in learning from it, we would have patience and comfort of the scriptures, and then that would give us hope. And this is kind of a principle concerning the study of history that we're kind of looking at. Why are we even looking at this stuff? I mean, who cares about all these dead people, right? I used to think that when I was in high school and they made us learn names and dates and stuff, and I'd be like, who cares? They're dead. Why do we care about that? Well, when you get older and a little bit wiser, I hope I get a little wiser, you begin to figure out that that stuff is important because it tells us what our heritage is. And heritage is important. In the Proverbs, it tells us not to remove the ancient landmarks. Remove not the ancient landmarks which thy fathers have set. And I find that as I travel around the world and I see, other Baptist churches, that sometimes I'll visit a Baptist church expecting one thing and seeing something else because somebody came along and moved the landmarks. And so now they're doing things or teaching things or practicing things that, traditionally we would have never have accepted, but now they accept it. And if you remember from the last couple of weeks, we were talking about some Baptist groups in history, and specifically one of those groups just kind of faded away because they began to work together with the reformers, and the next thing you know, they were no longer a Baptist group. Well, we've come up to the Reformation period now, and the Reformation period goes from 1500 to 1650, so you're looking at a period of about 150 years, and I think that this might be my favorite period in Baptist history to teach on. Excuse me. I've got a cold. Why do we call it a cold? We get it when we're cold? All I know is that Sunday night, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was just soaked with sweat. So I had to change my shirt, went back to sleep, soaked the sweat again, changed my shirt. 3 shirts soaked in sweat. My bed was soaking wet. I had to put a towel down so I could go back to sleep. It was terrible. My wife, the next morning, she woke up and she said, "How come the bed's wet?" I said, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. I went to the bathroom, really. But we ended up having to change all that and wash all that. But anyway, back to the subject at hand. So if I sound a little rough, that's because I still have a cold. I don't feel bad. I feel a little tired, but at least I'm not feeling bad anymore. So that's nice. So the Reformation. On the surface, the Reformation period appears to be a time of great religious liberty, but not really. The Protestants had liberty, but the feeling toward the Baptist groups never actually changed, and in some ways it actually got worse because we've gone through, up to this point, we've gone through hundreds of years of persecution from the Catholics. And, earlier than that, we were under persecution from the government, the Roman government. And then it was the Roman government and the Catholics, and it was just the Catholics. But now it's the Catholics and the Episcopalians and the Methodists and the Presbyterians, and they're all persecuting Baptists. We would like to think, okay, so the Reformers figured out some things were broken in the Catholic Church. So they decided that they were going to try to fix some things. And, some of the things that they were wanting to fix, were things like salvation by faith and, things of that nature. And we Baptists would go, yay, that's great. But unfortunately, though they were fixing or seeking to fix certain things in that way, their view towards the Baptist groups really didn't change much. So on the religious scene, many of the reformers, I should say, and we're going to look at some names of some reformers tonight, they actually stood against the Anabaptists for a variety of reasons, but mostly because of the differences concerning the doctrine and practice of baptism itself. And even today, if you when I'm out passing out, John and Romans or tracts or whatever, and I meet people, and I'll give them a tract or I'll give them a Bible or something, and they'll say, well, I'm a Presbyterian. And in Korea, that's very common to hear someone say, well, I'm a Presbyterian. And then I will ask them, well, what's the difference between Presbyterians and Baptists? Now, there are a number of differences. Church polity is a big deal. Autonomy of the local church is a big deal. But invariably, we will come to the conclusion in our conversation that the biggest difference is baptism. And it's interesting to me that they don't go, well, you guys believe that you're saved this way, but we believe that we're saved that way. That's never the issue. It's always baptism or church polity. Well, it's still true today. And these were the things going as far back as the Reformation that the Protestant groups did not like the Baptists because of baptism mostly. So I want to pause here for a moment and tell you that up to this point, we have built a case for the Baptists through history. The Baptists did not come out of Catholicism. Thus, Baptists are not Protestants. Now, a lot of people think that Baptists are Protestants. And you talk to a normal person out there on the street, and you tell them that you're Baptist, and they'll say, oh, okay, all right, so you're Protestant. I'm Protestant too. I'm Episcopalian or whatever. And they'll think that we are Protestants. There are even some slants on Baptist history where they'll trace Baptist history back to some guy, later on in history, and they'll say the Baptist started here or the Baptist started here. But again, if you look at the Baptist distinctives and trace that back through history, you're going to find groups that held to the Baptist distinctives going all the way back to the 1st century. They weren't called Baptists, but they were. And so the Baptist groups during the Reformation were very persecuted by the Protestant groups. And in defense of the Reformers, it's been asserted that the reason the Reformers persecuted the Anabaptists was because, in their words, the Anabaptists in the 1520s and the 1530s were radical, violent revolutionaries. And that was the claim that they held to. But again, what's the dates that I just gave you? Right, 1520s and 1530s. But I want to remind you that the Baptist groups, for the most part, were pacifists until the 1700s. So, especially in the 1500s, they would not have been radical, they would not have been violent, and they certainly would not have been revolutionaries. So, what do we say to that charge? Well, that's a phony charge. It wasn't at all true. So we come to Martin Luther, which is probably, as reformers go, probably the most famous name. And you know the story of Martin Luther, where he, wrote his letter and nailed it to the castle door, and ta-da, started the Reformation. Well, in reality, we just kind of faded to the Reformation. It didn't actually start on that date. But if you got to pick one, that's a good date to pick, I guess. But Martin Luther didn't like the Anabaptists. In fact, in AD 1536, Martin Luther signed a document written by Melanchthon assenting to the death penalty for Anabaptists. So let me tell you what that means. That means Martin Luther thought Baptists should die. That's what he thought, okay? It baffles my mind how many Baptist preachers and Baptist Christians today will quote Luther or speak of Luther as if he is some gigantic hero of the faith for Baptists. He was not. He hated us. He would have killed us if he'd have gotten the opportunity to do so. Now, it's possible that Luther had such a strong reaction against Anabaptists because a few years earlier, one of his own followers turned Anabaptist and became a leader. And this man wrote a letter to Luther saying this. He said to Luther, "I would like to smell your frying carcass." That's not the way to win friends or influence people, but that's what he did. But whether that's a reason or not, I don't know, because I didn't know Luther personally. I'm old. I'm not that old. But at any rate, the Lutheran movement was certainly no friend of the Baptists. Luther would happily stand idly by and watch the Anabaptists persecuted or even killed. It wouldn't have bothered him. In fact, he believed that that should be the case. And that takes us up to the next guy. Luther is not actually my favorite along those lines. The next guy is Ulrich Zwingli, 1484 to 1531. Another well-known reformer. You may not have heard of him if you've never studied church history or Christian history or Baptist history. You may have never heard of this man before. But he was actually very well known, and he had the appearance of one who would have sided with the Baptist. For one thing, he met Desiderius Erasmus at Basel in AD 1514. Let me pause there. Who is this guy? Who is Erasmus? You're breaking my heart. I gave you my book. He's all over my book.
All I know is he was a person of some importance because he wound up somehow his name was carved into a concrete, or not concrete, but a stone block they found amongst the ruins of the city that he lived in.
That's entirely possible. I didn't know that, actually. But here's what I know. I know that he gathered up a group of manuscripts and put together the Proto-Textus Receptus. Okay? All right, so that is what he is most known for. Anyway, so Zwingli met Erasmus at Basel in AD 1514, and there's some conjecture that he may have even assisted in Erasmus' work in the New Testament. Now, I don't know if that's actually true. Some people say that. Others say he did not. But what that shows us is that they had a kinship there. They were close. Another interesting point is that a group of Anabaptists actually followed Zwingli for a while, but there came a point when they felt that Zwingli had compromised himself, so they left the group. I tried to put myself in Zwingli's shoes for a minute, and I've got a congregation of people that are listening to me preach, and then all of a sudden a group of them are upset about something that I said or something that I did, and they leave. That would not give me a very happy disposition toward that group. So that may have actually contributed to Zwingli's feeling toward the Anabaptist. Another interesting point, in 1523, Zwingli compromised on infant baptism. Well, what does that mean? Okay, it goes on to say he compromised on infant baptism as well as a couple of other points, which caused some of his supporters to leave and start their own movement. So if he compromised on infant baptism, what does that mean? That means that before that point, he didn't support infant baptism, but for whatever reason, he changed his position or maybe just made his position publicly known. And when that happened, it caused a schism in the group. Among those were two prominent Anabaptists, Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz. And if you study Baptist history, you'll see those names again and again, especially Felix Manz. Obviously, their opponents stood against their movement when the Council of Zurich condemned them, and several were executed, including Felix Manz, and Zwingli didn't object. He stood idly by and watched them be executed. In fact, the schism was so bad that the Zurich city, first of all, where is Zurich? Yes. I've been there. It's a pretty cool place. It's got some cool history. Anyway, so the Zurich City Council stated that holding the position that only adults should be baptized would be treated as a capital offense. This clearly targets the Anabaptists because nobody else held that position. Zwingli stated that Anabaptists ought to be drowned, and that's exactly what they did. And I have a quote here for you from a worldhistory.org article, and it says, Felix Manz became the first Anabaptist martyr in Zurich. He's not the first martyr, but the first one in Zurich. In January of 1527, Manz was drowned in the following manner. He was first trussed and then taken by boat to the middle of the river Limmat, which runs through Zurich. A preacher at his side spoke kind words to him, encouraging him to recant, but then Manz perceived his mother, Anna Manz, with some other Anabaptists on the opposite bank, admonishing him to be steadfast in his faith. He did not recant, so he was heaved overboard. He sang with a loud voice, Into your hands I commend my spirit, as the waters closed over his head. Zwingli thought drowning a very fitting way of executing an Anabaptist. Manz was really fortunate, though, because most Anabaptists were severely tortured first and then burned at the stake. Zwingli's persecution was so severe that he all but extinguished the Anabaptists in Switzerland. Even today, if you go to Switzerland, Baptists are not a very big group. John Calvin. We know John Calvin for what reason? The Calvinists. Calvinism. Right? That's all we ever think of Calvin. It surprises me so many Baptist churches are leaning toward what I call hyper-Calvinism without really knowing much about Calvin himself. But anyway, John Calvin advised, this is what he advised, this is what he said, this is what his public statement was, that all Anabaptists should be put to death. That was his position. And nowadays, Baptists quote him right and left. I don't get it. If he were alive today, let's put it this way, if we were alive back then, we wouldn't be quoting Calvin. We'd be hiding from him. He wanted to kill Baptists. He said so. He thought that we should all be put to death. He had such struggles with Servetus, an Anabaptist leader, that he felt that the only way to beat them, you've heard the phrase, if you can't beat them, then join them? No. He said, if you can't beat them, then burn them. And he's supposed to be my friend. No, I don't think so. Politically, Now that's on the religious scene, okay? That's the reformers. So now let's move to political scene. Politically, the Baptists faced tyranny and persecution from the government as well. And you could start with King Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547. He wanted a divorce. King Henry VIII was known for, his wives and, the things. Anyway, not to get off on that. But he wanted a divorce, but the Catholic Church said no. So he started his own church, the Episcopalians, also known as the Church of England. And King Henry hated the Baptists for the same reasons that Rome did. Catholicism hated the Baptists, and that was because of infant baptism. So in 1534, he issued a law stating that all persons would either baptize their children within 12 days or they had to leave England. 12 days. So imagine you are an Anabaptist and you've got a wife and several children and they're not baptized because, they're young and they can't express their faith, so they're not baptized. And now the law comes out. This is a law from the government that says, thou shalt baptize thy children, or in 12 days thou shalt die if you're still in England. 12 days. I don't know how many people, compromised or how many people stood firm. But the fact is, he issued a law. So the Baptists in England were going to either baptize their children or they were going to have to leave. In 1539, he issued another law that those who are in any error as sacramentarians, Anabaptists, or any others that sell books having such opinions in them, once known, both the books and such persons shall be detected and disclosed immediately to the King's Majesty or one of his privy council to the intent to have it punished without favor, even with the extremity of the law. So in other words, imagine that you are a young Anabaptist guy and you go out and you give somebody a tract, your Baptist literature. Well, he's not too happy about that. So he goes and tells the government. And the government comes and gets you, and you're punished to the full extent of the law, which, as we know, what King Henry VIII thought about that. So there was a lot of political pressure against the Anabaptists from him. And I've got a footnote in the book, footnote 42. It says, the effects of his quarrel with Rome, when King Henry VIII had his fallout with the Catholic Church, his quarrel with Rome emboldened the Baptists to leave their hiding places. And, says Fox, speaking of the influence of Anne Boleyn over Henry, we read of no persecution nor any abjuration to have been in the Church of England, save only that the registers of London make mention of certain Anabaptists, of whom 10 were put to death in sundry places in the realm. Other 10 repented and were saved. So, he wasn't looking for everybody. He was just really looking for the Baptists. And then we come to William Warham, who is another political enemy of the Anabaptists. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I like reading names like Canterbury. It reminds me of the old movies, King Arthur's Court and all of that. But he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was a friend of King Henry VIII, and he required the general population to make this affirmation. And I've got this outlined for you in the book, 3 main points. First one is that infants must needs be christened because they are born in original sin, which sin must needs be remitted and which only can be done in the sacrament of baptism. Okay, so what did he believe about baptism then? He believed that baptism saved. And since you're born with original sin, let's get them saved, get them baptized. Which, of course, Baptists don't believe that. We believe in original sin, but we don't believe that baptism saves. His second point, that children or men once baptized can or ought never be baptized again. Anyone rebaptized was to be burned to death. So imagine now you are an Episcopalian. You're doing all right in the Episcopalian church, but then you start actually reading your Bible a little closer, come to understand that, you know what, those Anabaptists are right. So you go find yourself an Anabaptist group, and you join them. And in order to join them, you have to be rebaptized because, after all, the Church of England sprinkled. So you get rebaptized, and now suddenly, because you got rebaptized, you have broken the law, a capital offense, and you are to be executed simply for being rebaptized. And executed how? No, they didn't give you a little pill and watch you go to sleep and never wake up. No. They burned you to death. I can't think of a more horrifying way to die than to be burned slowly. To me, that would just be horrifying. And that's what they did. Simply because you got rebaptized. I don't know what they did to the people that did the rebaptizing, but I'm pretty sure it was similar. The third thing that he said was that they ought to repute and take all the Anabaptists and every man's opinion agreeing with said Anabaptists for detestable heresies and utterly be condemned. So let's pause there for a moment. What was the punishment for heresy? Death. Remember, I told you what the Catholics would do if they charged you with heresy. They would give you the chance to recant. And if you recanted, then maybe God would be merciful with you, but they were still going to burn your body. That was their way of thinking. You were going to die one way or the other. Okay? So, this is what he remembered. This guy made the people take this oath. So, you know, the average run-of-the-mill guy out there who's not really religious, he's taking an oath now that if he finds out that somebody's an Anabaptist, he's supposed to turn him in. Yeah, it was dark days for the Baptists. Then we have Edward VI, 1547 to 1553. He said, all crimes can be pardoned. You kill somebody, it can be pardoned. You rape somebody, it can be pardoned. You steal, it can be pardoned. All crimes can be pardoned except the crime of being a Baptist. So if you're a Baptist, you don't get pardoned. Sorry about that. No pardon for you. At this time, John Calvin was agreeing to this, that every Anabaptist should be put to death. Can you imagine being an Anabaptist in this time period? It would be a fearful time to live. You know, today, here's what we do. You know, we're Baptists today, and we believe, you know, in our Baptist distinctives, and then, you know, the government does something to challenge, you know, our faith, and what do? We worry and we fret and we wonder what we're going to do about it, and oh, woe is me. Back then, they were dying for it, and they still stood. You know, all of this persecution did something for them, though. Do you know what it did? This goes back to one of our first lessons. What does persecution do for the church? Okay, it purges it. So if a couple of soldiers came in here on a Sunday morning and, you know, locked the doors and said, all right, you must recant, not Jesus, recant a baptism by immersion, or we're going to kill you. But why? Because baptism saves. So you must recant of your belief in baptism or we're going to kill you. What do you think would happen? There will be those who really have convictions, who will stand for that conviction. But I got a feeling a lot of people would say, you know, this is not something I'm willing to die for. And they will recant and then they will leave. So the group you're left with is a smaller group. You're not going to join a group knowing that that could happen either. So persecution, though it is a horrible thing, has the side effect of keeping the church pure. Mary Tudor, also known as Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor didn't just hate the Anabaptists, she kind of hated everybody. She was an equal opportunity persecutor. She was trying to bring Catholicism back as versus Episcopalians. So she persecuted everybody. If you weren't Catholic, you were persecuted. There's a reason why she's called Bloody Mary, and it's not because she liked alcohol, okay? Then Queen Elizabeth. Well, you had Mary Tudor from 1553 to 1558, and then Queen Elizabeth, 1558 to 1603. Queen Elizabeth was light years better than Bloody Mary. She sought unity in religion. Let's pause there for a moment. Is unity in religion a good thing? No? What do you think?
Unity in religion, that implies that all religions are one. At least to me it would.
Okay, so let's all join hands and sing, you know, Kumbaya, my Lord. And what do you think? What happens? What must happen in order to have unity of religions? Now let's just talk about the unity of Christianity. Let's not throw in the Hindus and the Buddhists and all of that. Let's just say everything that calls itself Christian. What is going to happen if we have unity among all of these various groups? Yes. That is the main problem right there. Compromise in doctrine. Okay? So everybody is going to have to set aside what they actually believe in order to get along with everybody else. Well, Queen Elizabeth thought it was a great idea. She wanted unity in religion. She wanted unity in church government. She wanted unity in worship, unity in discipline. So she gave freedom of religion to everyone except the Baptists. So for the last 10 years, she persecuted the Baptists and demanded that all preachers preach against them. So now, imagine that you are an Episcopalian preacher, because after all, this is England and that's the church, right? You're Episcopalian, and you're Episcopalian, but you don't really hate the Anabaptists. Not everybody did, of course. But you've got your congregation of people, and you preach to them, but you don't really, go there, okay? But now the Queen says, you will go there. You will preach to your people that the Anabaptists are wicked, bad, and they deserve to die. And you have to preach that. Okay? No choice. She said that she demanded that all preachers preach against the Anabaptists. One of the most famous rulers in England was King James, 1603 to 1625. Yes, that King James, okay? King James, 1611, King James, King James. At the beginning of his reign, the Baptists were a weakened group. Why? Because of everything they had just gone through, that's why. They were a weakened group. It was commonplace for Baptists to be executed by the state for refusing to conform to the Church of England's teachings. But in 1612, that's interesting. That's just 1 year after the 1611, King James 1611 was published. Just 1 year after the translation that bears his name was first published, King James put an end to the martyrdom with a new policy. He said, I will never allow in my conscience that the blood of any man shall be shed for diversity of opinions in religion. However, though they were no longer being martyred, they were still being arrested and thrown in prison to rot. So King James says, no, we're not going to kill them. We're just going to lock them up. So on one hand, history goes, King James, yay. And believe me, I am thankful for the Bible that we have. I'm thankful that he, authorized gathering up the smartest men that were, that graced the planet probably in that day to give us a good translation, and I'm glad of all of that. But at the same time, he wasn't really a friend of the Baptist either. In fact, they didn't have a whole lot of friends. In the words of a prisoner, Our miseries are long and lingering imprisonments for many years in diverse countries of England, in which many have died and left behind them widows and many small children, taking away our goods and others the like, of which we can make good probation, not for any disloyalty to your majesty, nor hurt to any mortal man, and adversaries themselves being judges, but only because we dare not assent unto and practice in the worship of God such things as we have no faith in, because it is sin against the Most High. Interesting statement. That's what a prisoner wrote. This came from a tract called A Most Humble Supplication of Many of the King Majesty's Loyal Subjects, ready to testify all civil obedience by the oath of allegiance or otherwise, and that of conscience, who are persecuted only for differing in religion, contrary to divine and human testimonies. I think they had very long names for tracts back in those days. All right? And you can find that cited by John Cramp in a Baptist history book that he wrote. We wish that the story ended well, but it doesn't. Even though the Baptists petitioned the king on several occasions, even proving from the Bible that their teachings were biblical, every petition they made was rejected. All right, so who are these groups? I've already mentioned the Anabaptists several times, but there's another group before them, the Welsh Baptists. They're not as well known. But they had a worldwide influence. Nearly all church historians agree that the Welsh Baptists trace back into antiquity. Let me put that in modern terms. We don't know where the Welsh Baptists started. Their origins go back into antiquity. We don't know where it all began. There is a certain level of disagreement as to the specifics, but generally speaking, historians agree that Joseph of Arimathea was the first recorded preacher in Wales. That's interesting. Who is Joseph of Arimathea? Okay, so the Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus to death had two good men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. It was Joseph of Arimathea's family tomb that Jesus was laid in. His dead body was placed in that tomb. And as a believer, according to history, he traveled to Wales. And he was the first recorded preacher in Wales. Were there others there before him? Maybe. Maybe not. We do know that, historically speaking, he went there. And a couple quotes here for you. It is universally thought to be the oldest church, the Welsh church, Welsh Baptists, but how old, none can tell. And then another quote, in an old history of the Welsh Baptists are recorded the labors and the sufferings of an intelligent, active Baptist layman who from Wales passed into England in a company with a preacher. His name was Walter Brute. Walter Brute was a friend of William Tyndale from his days at Oxford. He, under conviction of the truth, returned to Wales and became such a mighty force that Catholicism was in danger in Wales. Walter Brute was such a powerful apologist for the Baptists that, come on in, join us, whoever you are. Is that my son's voice I hear? I think it is. All right. That deep voice has got to be Caleb. Did they actually let you out of prison? They did. Amen. You broke out. Well, I'm glad you broke out. Come on in. You looking sharp. Anyway, back to Walter Brute. And who was he a friend of? Let's get our train of thought going again. William Tyndale. Who was William Tyndale? Okay, he translated the Bible into English. Remember that? Okay. So Walter Brute was arrested and brought before the Bishop of Herefordshire, and the bishop couldn't withstand him. In other words, Walter Brute was such a powerful apologist for the Baptist position that you couldn't argue against him. And he was therefore condemned. You know, I can just imagine this in my mind where the bishop goes, all right, I don't want to hear anymore. That's it, you're condemned. Forget it. Away with him. And what a way to win an argument, right? If you can't win with words, you just get the guy killed. So he was condemned as an Anabaptist. And another quote for you, and you can see where that came from. In the footnote there, you can see the book that it came from. But it says this, it says, William Tyndale, who translated the Bible into the English language and the first 4 books of the Old Testament into the Welsh language in 1536, was a Welsh Baptist of that plain, strict apostolic order. He lived most of his time in Gloucester, England. See, you thought it was Gloucester, but it's not. It's Gloucester. I know, because where I live or where I'm from, we got a Gloucester, and it's spelled just like that. So it's Gloucester, right? Yep, Gloucester, England. But Llewellyn Tyndale and Hezekiah Tyndale were members of the Baptist Church in Abergavenny, South Wales. So the Welsh, I'm struggling with that word tonight. The Baptists in Wales hold the dubious honor of being the last group of Baptists persecuted by the Catholic Church. They're the last group. It's not widely known, but the Baptists in Wales contributed more than any other group to the propagation of Baptist distinctives in America. The Welsh Baptists, I love those guys. I love those guys because every now and then I'll meet a guy, a Baptist guy, who believes in church succession. You remember what that is? I hear crickets. Church succession. It is just exactly what it sounds like. It's like our Baptist church was started by another Baptist church, which was started by another Baptist church, which was started by another Baptist church, all the way back to the first Baptist church in Jerusalem. All right? So that's church succession, and there are people that believe that. And I love to meet those guys because then I'm like, well, do you believe that the Welsh Baptists were actually Baptists? Nobody's going to say no to that. Church history would, the Welsh Baptists would come out of the grave and choke you half to death if you say no to that. But they have no answer, and that's good that they have no answer because we don't know where they came from. We have no idea. The best we can do is say, well, we believe that Joseph of Arimathea went to Wales and he preached, so maybe that's where it started, but we got no proof. We don't know. They just kind of appear in history. And they're such an incredible group that their preaching and their propagation of what they believed reached all the way over into the United States. So here, let me give you some things on that. All right? We got a whole lot here in the book. I got plenty of time, so we're good. All right? Much of the formative work of Rhode Island, New Jersey, Virginia, yay, New York, Delaware, and Pennsylvania was done by them. The first Baptist church in the United States was established in Providence, Rhode Island, by a Welshman. The first Baptist church in what is now the state of Massachusetts was founded by a Welshman. The first Baptist church now in Pennsylvania, the mother of the Philadelphia Association and many churches in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, kept its records in the Welsh language for many years. And its first Bible, which was treasured by the American Baptist Historical Society, was in Welsh. The Welsh Tract Church, which was the first holding our faith in Delaware, and for many years a most influential community, was formed in Wales, came out to this country as a body, and after remaining a short time at Lower Dublin, settled permanently in Delaware. There's not a state in the Union where Welshmen have not had an honored part in furthering Baptist interests. Roger Williams, the fearless champion of civil and religious liberty, whose teaching and example did so much to introduce into the Constitution its distinguishing excellence, he was, what do you think, a Welsh Baptist. John Miles, who exerted such a powerful influence upon Baptist progress in the early days of our history. Dr. Samuel Jones of Lower Dublin and the Venerable Isaac Eaton, the first mastery of Hopewell Academy. Abel Morgan, Morgan Edwards, distinguished as writers and preachers. David Thomas, the veteran preacher of Virginia and Kentucky. David Jones, Horatio Gates Jones, and John Williams of New York. All men of might in their day were Welshmen or the immediate descendants of Welshmen. The Welsh Baptists left quite an impact in America. Well, what did they believe? We know what they believe because we believe what they believe. As to their beliefs, we have plenty of proof. We're looking at a point in history much closer to our time now. So we have much more, material to examine to see what they believe. We have ample proof. In 1519, 6 years before Luther appeared before the Diet of Worms, a letter was addressed to Erasmus from Bohemia. Erasmus. Who is that guy? A lot of people today don't like him. Who was he? There we go. Please do not forget this name. Yes. Now, he actually didn't, I'm kind of getting off the beaten path here, but I'm going to do it just for the sake of clarity. He actually didn't, he's credited with the first Textus Receptus, but the reality is the Textus Receptus went through like 33 revisions after him. So the Textus Receptus that we have today, if you compare it to his first work, you're going to find a lot of differences. So I like to call it a prototype. Okay? You can call it what you want, but anyway, back to the notes. 1519, 6 years before Luther appeared before the Diet of Worms, a letter was addressed to Erasmus from Bohemia, thus describing these people. These men have no other opinion of the Pope, cardinals, bishops, and other clergy than of manifest antichrists. The Welsh Baptists thought that the Pope was the Antichrist. They called the Pope sometimes the beast and sometimes the whore, mentioned in Revelation. Their own bishops and the priests that they themselves do choose for themselves, ignorant and unlearned laymen that have wife and children. They mutually salute one another by the name of brother or sister. How do you like that, Brother Willie? They own no other authority than the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. What is that? The Bible is sole authority for faith and practice. They slight all the doctors, both ancient and modern, and give no regard to their doctrine, individual soul liberty. Their priests, when they celebrate the office of Mass or communion, do it without any priestly garments, nor do they use any prayer or collects on this occasion, but only the Lord's Prayer, by which they consecrate bread that has been leavened. They believe or own little or nothing of the sacraments of the church. Such as came over to their sect must everyone be baptized anew in mere water. They make no blessing of salt, nor of water, nor make any use of consecrated oil. They believe nothing of divinity in the sacrament of the Eucharist, only that the consecrated bread and wine do, by some occult signs, represent the death of Christ, and accordingly, that all that do knee down to it or worship are guilty of idolatry. What are they saying? They didn't believe in transubstantiation. The bread was just bread, and the wine was just wine, and if you believe otherwise, you're guilty of idolatry. That the sacrament was instituted by Christ to no other purpose but to renew the memory of his passion, and not to be carried about or held up by the priest to be gazed on. For Christ himself, who is to be adored and worshipped with the honor of latreia, sits at the right of God, as the Christian church confesses in the creed. Prayers to saints and for the dead, they count a vain and ridiculous thing, as likewise auricular confession and penance enjoined by the priest for sins. Eves and fast days are, they say, a mockery and a disguise of hypocrites. You can't read that without coming away going, yeah, these Welsh Baptists were definitely Baptists. Not only were they called Baptists, but they were Baptists. All right? So here's the Baptist acrostic. Biblical authority, they own no other authority than the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. Autonomy of the local church. No other opinion of the Pope, cardinals, bishops, and clergy than manifest antichrist. They called the Pope sometimes a beast, sometimes a whore. You can't get away from that. Priesthood of the believers. Prayers to the saints and for the dead were a vain and ridiculous thing. Auricular confession and penance, they saw that as being ridiculous. 2 ordinances. We read all that they, what they said about the sacraments of the church. They believed that it was just bread and it was just wine, and that's it. And they baptized, let me say it this way, they rebaptized people that came over from other groups. They rebaptized them in mere water, not holy water, mere water. I always wondered what would happen if I went into some Catholic church, because usually you go in and they got a basin there with water in it, and you're supposed to go in, and I watched this, the one time I actually went to a Catholic church, and I watched it when I went in there, and people were coming up to the water and, doing this kind of thing with the water, and I was like, wow, I thought he was going to get himself a drink, and he just put it on his face. What's going on there? I found out later that that's supposed to be holy water. I wonder what would happen if, say, the day before church, somebody went out back and turned their water off and they couldn't fill that thing up, because I know it's tap water. I know it's tap water. Priest slips in there at 2:30 in the morning and fills that thing up with a hose. I know it. I don't know it, but you get my point. Priesthood of the believers. Yeah, they believe that. 2 ordinances. Well, there's no mention of anything else. So yes, they believe that. Individual soul liberty. Well, they rejected organized church, state rule over the church, confession to priests. They must have held to the principles of soul liberty. You're not going to, be able to hold the principles of soul liberty and do those things. So that is good support for that. Saved church membership. They believe or own little or nothing of the sacraments of the church. In other words, they place their belief in salvation in something other than the sacraments. Obviously, the scriptures. 2 offices. Well, again, by the quote that I read to you, their own bishops and priests. So the guy that wrote that quote was obviously not a Baptist, but he said they choose for themselves ignorant and unlearned laymen that have wife and children. Oh no. Obviously, they believed in pastors and deacons. Separation of church and state. It's agreed by all historians that they never came from the Catholic Church and never had any government sanction. So yes, separation of church and state. Were they Baptists? Obviously. Okay. All right, any questions on the Welsh Baptists before we move on to the Anabaptists? I got about 5 minutes left, so I want to try to get down to Michael Sattler, and we'll talk about him next week, I think. Of all the historical groups that we have thus far considered, the Anabaptists are probably the group that most people have heard of. As to their background, before the rise of Luther and Calvin, there lay concealed in almost all the countries of Europe, particularly in Bohemia, Moravia, Switzerland, and Germany, many persons who adhered tenaciously to the doctrine, etc., which is the true source of all the peculiarities that are to be found in the religious doctrine and disciplines of the Anabaptists. In other words, they were everywhere. The Anabaptists descended from the Waldenses. Remember them from last week? Okay. Historians credit the Anabaptists with being the originators of the separation of church and state, of modern liberty and the doctrine of a regenerate church membership. However, the fact is these principles were already taught in the Bible from the very first century. So if you look at what the historians say, they trace those things back to the Anabaptists, and I don't know how they can do that because those principles are written in the Word of God, and the Word of God was written in the first century. So clearly they believed it in the first century. But that's what they say. A number of their leaders were of note, such as Michael Sattler. So I want to stop here, and I want to give you a little homework. I want you to go out on the internet and find some information on Michael Sattler. There's two kinds of information out there. Well, actually three. There's the Catholic view of Michael Sattler, which you won't find that in very many places because they really don't talk about him much. Then there's the Protestant view of Michael Sattler, where he was instrumental in actually starting the Anabaptists. And then there is the, true historical view of Michael Sattler. So go out there and read some things on that. And I want you to get a feel for this man and who he is, and try to remember the time in which we are talking. We're talking about the Reformation period, okay? And just kind of get a feel for him. And then we'll talk about him next week before we get into the lesson on him, okay? Any questions on that?
So, Catholic view, Protestant view, and...
Well, I'm just telling you that there's several different opinions out there on Michael Sattler, and I'm telling you that because I want you to be careful and make sure you don't, get the wrong kind of stuff and get the jaded, not quite true stuff on him. But next week when we talk about it, then I'll be able to know if you hit the right vein or not, just based upon the things that you say about him. And we'll try to put him into the time in which he lived. All right? Anything else? All right. With all that said, let us close in prayer. And I'm glad you came in. Did you get off? Are you off or you got to go back? Oh, praise God for that. Why don't you close us in prayer? Amen. Amen. Yes.